So, a couple of things. I am honored to be on the panel with some really smart guys. And Amelia, my daughter in the back, on the way back, she's going to say, boy, they were really smart. You don't belong on that panel with them. But what we do all day long is spend time doing asset protection and estate planning. So if you spend your day building assets, where is your risk? And where is your exposure? So, of course, one is if you pass away. Another is if you become incapacitated. Another is if you back up your car in the shopping center in Harrison, New York, and you hit the 85-year-old woman whose grandson went to Harvard Law School and is looking for one opportunity to earn back all the gifts he got since First Communion. And what can you do to protect against that? Asset protection starts when you're young, and it means when you're 18 years of age, there are things that you need to do. First, what do we do to build our net worth when we're young, and then what do we do to protect it? So as young people, when you start working, these are elementary things to do, but you should find out whether you can fund an IRA. You can do that up to $5,500. If you're working in a firm, you want to ask to maximize your IRA contributions. These are key things because you can roll out of them. And by rolling out of them when you leave your firm, you can then self-direct your IRAs. And I've found my wife and I have now self-direct our own, and we bought a handful of properties with our IRAs and with leverage. Start thinking about life insurance because when you're young, insurance is cheap because you live, you have a longer time on the planet. You should also start writing checks to yourself once every 2 weeks. I found a good idea was to invest in real estate. So when I was just out of law school working at one of the biggest firms in the city, I bought my first piece of real estate out in the Hamptons. And back then in 1985, I paid $161,000 for it. And I said, this is going to be great. And 8 years later, I sold it for a cool $125,000. And the good thing is that when you're young, you have the opportunity to make mistakes. And I think that this is a key piece to do when you're at that early period in your life. I'm going to skip down to the bottom one, which is when you're now driving. First of all, those of you who are in your 20s, and we have a great group of people in 20s and their 30s here, you should remind your folks to get property and casualty insurance bump-ups in their umbrella coverage. So I got $10 million of umbrella coverage when my first daughter turned 18 years of age. Why? Because she can't find a glass that she doesn't like to knock over on the kitchen table. I can't imagine what's going to happen when she's driving a 4,000-pound vehicle. So we want to protect her and the family. I'm not a huge fan of you doing a will at the time you turn 18 years of age or in your 20s, but if you have some assets, for sure, because the key is you want to name representatives in your family to serve as your executor, who will be the representative acting on your behalf. You also want to address what we think is even more important, and that is that in your 20s, you believe you're invincible. And so your risks are that you're driving your bike in Central Park and you go over a storm sewer and you go head over heels. It sounds awfully graphic, but I did that, and wound up in an ambulance headed to Colombia. I cannot act on my behalf at that time because I have a broken shoulder and I've had a concussion. So somebody has to act on your behalf. So once you turn 18, your parents cannot act at all for you. Name your folks, if those are who are close to you, and then name siblings. And then as you get into your late 20s, if you're privileged, and we pray that you will, have the opportunity, you'll name your significant other who becomes your spouse, and you'll be in good shape. These are key things: powers of attorney, healthcare proxies, living wills. So the minute you turn 18, and dads and moms, the minute that your children turn 18, you have a little cake, put a little hat on their head, we'll sing happy birthday, and then we have them sign the documents. My toughest client at 18, who did not easily go through signing this, was Amelia's older sister, who just stopped short of hiring separate counsel to review the documents for us. But she worked that, so I would encourage you. So now we move on to the next group, which is the group that's 2 to 10 million. How do you get from 2 to 10 million when you're recently married? Well, things move quickly because you're continuing your savings plans. You're buying that first home. Maybe you're improving its value. You're paying down the mortgage. Maybe it's a rental property. You're getting life insurance. All of these things can add up pretty quickly. So first thing, you want to get that first group. Remember, get all of those documents in place. You also want to start to think about long-term capital gains treatment. In the old days, we could trade in and out of positions, and we paid 15%, and then maybe a 7 or 8% number on the state level. Today, we're at 20 on the federal level. We have the Obama surtax, which adds another almost 4%, and then we have nearly 10% on the state level, depending state by state. So you have to be respectful of this idea that your gain is not $100, it's $100 less 30%. We'll talk a little bit more about ways, and there are very, very few, to avoid the gains tax. The key thing is once you're married, you want to first acknowledge your spouse and leave the assets in trust to your spouse. In the old days, we would choose institutions, but spouses felt shackled to the trustee, and they said, what way do I have to get out of this? I have this institution. Is it more porridge, please? Am I begging them for money? Today, we love the institutions. We love J.P. Morgan, who does a phenomenal job in not only managing it, but serving as an institution in distributing it. But you can also have your spouses in that position. There are many attorneys that will say, just create a trust for the purposes of saving estate tax. And we'll talk in a minute about what the estate tax rates are. I think you should leave all of your assets in trust to your surviving spouse. It's oversimplified because your IRAs can't go directly to your spouse. You have to roll them into your spouse's name and then allow them to roll them to your children or other loved ones in trust. But overall, by leaving your assets in trust to your surviving spouse, you're putting them in a position of protection in a way that better protecting than you can for yourself. Because often clients will say, I love that idea. If my wife is getting $8 million, I know that she doesn't have to worry about a handful of issues you've presented. I'd like to do that myself. And so the answer is, in a word, no. You can't. There are states in the nation that allow for it. Delaware, South Dakota, Nevada, and Alaska are the classic ones. If you decide to set up a trust, I would recommend Alaska. There's great salmon fishing. You can go up there and you can deduct it as an expense of the trust. But away from that, I would tell you that be happy enough that you can leave these assets in trust for your surviving spouse and allow them to enjoy it. Big issue. If we're talking about protecting the assets, you pass away, we can pass these assets free of tax to your surviving spouse. Your surviving spouse marries. All the friends say you should sign a prenuptial. He or she says, I love this woman, I love this man, I'm a hopeless romantic, and things move forward. We always tell that spouse, keep your assets on your balance sheet. Don't integrate them into the marital estate, because if you divorce, they get, as Eddie Murphy said 20 years ago in Stand-Up Routine, half. So we want to protect that, number one. But the key thing is that when your spouse remarries, your surviving spouse remarries, and then dies, your spouse's estate is subject to attack from your surviving spouse's new husband or new wife. It's called the right of election. It is one of the most significant issues that you need to protect against when you are married, because you can leave those to your wife, but then when your wife dies, even though you intend completely to have those passed to your children, they will not, because your spouse's surviving spouse has the right to take 1/3. They'd get 0 in divorce, they get 1/3 in death, okay? Key piece. So the last piece is to start to think about, for those of you who are married and have children under 18, focus not just on guardianship, but on a plan and a path for them. We put in significant provisions to raise the children in the way that you want. We create advisory groups. My best friend runs a large fund in Greenwich. He has no time to raise our kids, but he is an important person to touch that base with our kids. And so he will reach out to the guardians and give them his proper thoughts and advice. We put in religious provisions because we're spiritual and we want to recommend that to others, whether that is if you're a Christian or Catholic, making sure that they're, if they haven't received First Communion, receive all the sacraments. It is not typical for lawyers to do this, but we believe deeply that regardless of the client, we want to address the spiritual piece. I think the last piece is life insurance. And so this piece we want to just finalize by saying that you bought life insurance early because it was inexpensive. Life insurance is a wonderful wealth replacement vehicle and income replacement vehicle for your spouse, but it's also a cash accumulation vehicle. And today, insurance is not the way it was for your grandparents, and there are very sophisticated ways to allow cash to compound inside a policy. The only thing that O.J. Simpson didn't do well after he lost his civil case was that he didn't have a large block of life insurance, which would have been asset protected. He has a great IRA. He moved his primary residence to Florida, and they can't take your residence away. But life insurance is a wonderful way to act. Okay, now we're to a little bit of the grown-up group, which is the group that's north of $10 million. Big issues that you have to focus on if you are if we're focusing on the wealth. And you can have the best yield on your portfolio, but somehow death has a somewhat of dilatory impact on your net worth before it gets to the kids. So 40% on the federal level after $5.43 million. Husband and wife, we can combine the exemptions, and so 11.86 million can pass free of tax, but then you get spanked with a 40% tax. You also have a 10% tax on the state level. New York is after $3 million, just north of that, but that exemption is rising. Connecticut's a little over $2 million, and New Jersey hangs in there like a rock at $675,000. So you want to focus on ways to minimize those taxes, and you can do that by moving assets off your balance sheet while you're alive. What is a classic one that you can do? It's to put the beach house into trust. It is not asset protected until the tax strategy is first dispensed with. But a classic is to say you've got a house in the Hamptons, by putting it into a trust but allowing the use and enjoyment of it for yourselves for a period of time, we're able to discount that gift because you're not in effect giving your loved ones a gift that is worth $5 million in a house. You're giving them a house down the road which you can continue to use and enjoy during a period of years. And that discount allows you to move the asset off your balance sheet with less tax effect, and then it flows into trust for your kids. We are concerned about these kids who marry your daughters and sons-in-law who say, I think we should sell that house and have our own for ourselves, while mom and dad are still alive. So what we do is always would recommend that you do is to have provisions in the final trust that say we can't sell the house until mom and dad decide to vacate. We also will have a lease because once the children own the house, we now have to find a way to fund the expenses for the house. And this is a fantastic way to actually overload assets into the children by having rent higher than the expenses. Also, think about loaning assets to your children. And again, as the asset protection vehicle here, the smartest people who've built up net worth are constantly finding ways to move assets into their children's names into protected vehicles where those assets are compounding, where the children don't have access to the assets for many, many years. But they're outside the compound wall, so that when the good Lord pulls us away, they're looking at what's inside the compound, not what's outside. So grats are a way of loaning assets to your children and letting the growth take place in their name, and then they pay you back the loan, and it's not considered a gift. So if you've used your $10 million of exemptions, tax exemptions, you can now treat loans. And we have people that are doing multiple grats at any given time. This is an area that President Obama is significantly opposed to because he sees grats as a way that only represent the wealthy. And President Obama largely has viewed this as unfair to those who don't have assets. So I finish on that piece to say at some point grats will be shortened or outlawed, and it's a great way now to move assets. I think I want to finish by talking about charities. By giving assets to charity, today we spent an entire day, my daughter was there as well, where clients of ours are moving $10 million into a foundation, and they're starting to interview. And so it was really neat because I got a primer today on a more sophisticated presentation by Jason and Steve on where the markets are going. But we think that foundations are wonderful ways to keep your family together, and to have them learn once a year that they can give a gift of a certain amount to the charities, those places in need, and yet the assets inside the foundation are compounding free of tax. You also get a charitable deduction in that piece as well. So these final pieces are just ways to move assets off your balance sheet before you pass away. One cute piece that we spoke about before. If you have one asset that has grown significantly and the gain is several million dollars, and your parents don't have significant assets, you can do something called upstream gifting. And that means, so for example, if I have an office building that's worth $5 million with a gain of $3 million, I can give it to my dad, and my dad then, when he passes away, allows the tax configuration to be restructured. We call it resetting the basis from my original purchase price to the fair market value. And by doing that, when I sell it, I can save the 30% gains tax. And so upstream gifting is a very clever way. Also, you should be speaking about moving assets in and out of your name to avoid having low basis assets in your trust. Everything that you keep in your name will get a step up in basis. Keep those in your name before you pass away. Okay, that is it for me, but I would say this. The most important piece to your planning is to realize that the estate tax is going to have a large impact on your wealth unless you start to do the planning incrementally, what we call taking acorns out of your front yard and tossing them into your kid's yard, putting a fence around it so they don't drive over it with their ATV, but protecting that long term so that those acorns grow off your balance sheet and significantly into mighty oaks one day.